Today is Monday, the 6th of September, 2021, and I welcome you all again to another new old episode of Intuitive Reactions, the MENA and Gulf regions. And today's episode, I would like to dedicate it to the late Georges Nassif, a dear friend, a Lebanese brilliant journalist, a friend of the Middle East Council of Churches, member in his youth of the Orthodox movement, and a lot more. I met Georges Nassif first time in Cyprus many moons ago. And then our conversations continued both in Cyprus and in Lebanon. And in Lebanon, I used to go to the An-Nahar building and go up to his office. And his office was basically a small cubicle. And when you went into that cubicle, you had the space for about 2 or at best 3 chairs. But what also welcomed you is the smell of cigarettes, because Georges was also an inveterate smoker. He also was an intellectual, a thinker, an Arabist with a brilliant command of the Arabic language and a very good analyst of political affairs and political issues, be they those in Lebanon, his homeland, or across the MENA region. Georges passed away a couple of days ago at the age of 72 after a long and incapacitating illness. And I remember a few years ago, I was spending one of my summers, academic summers, call them, in Germany, and I came across a woman whom I found out to be his niece, and who told me about how he was struggling with his incapacitation, with the difficulties, the physical ailments that he had suffered, and how he was trying to get through them. That was a few years ago. Now, Georges is no more with us. He is, because he was a faithful Christian, an Orthodox Antiochian Christian from Lebanon. He is now, hopefully, in heavenly Jerusalem. So, Georges, salamat u alf salam, many greetings to you. Today, in my intuitive reactions, I want to very briefly go over a few points, just reminders of what is happening in this neighborhood that I call mine, for want of another description. The first one, of course, that today everybody was talking about is the prisoners who were in the Gilboa prison in Israel and who had escaped. Now, you don't know Gilboa, most of you. The prison is called a safe because it's supposed to be the most secure prison in Israel. And it is just north of Jenin in the Palestinian West Bank. And Jenin is in the north of the West Bank. So these people use their rusty spoon, it seems, to dig a hole under the sink in the bathroom and eventually get that hole in a kind of a mini tunnel to just outside the prison where they escaped. They're well-known Palestinian prisoners, security prisoners for Israel, and of course freedom fighters for Palestinians, many Palestinians. And the escape will, in my opinion, unless they are caught quite quickly, will, in my opinion, create a lot of embarrassment for a lot of people. Just think, what would happen if these prisoners were to flee into the West Bank, into territories supposedly controlled by the Palestinian Authority? What would be the position of the Palestinian Authority then? No doubt the Israeli security soldiers and intelligence services will rush into the West Bank. They go in and out anyway, as if it were still very much their own land, they would go in there to chase them and arrest them. What would the Palestinian Authority do? What would President Mahmoud Abbas do? Would they defend those Palestinian prisoners as freedom fighters, or would they collaborate with Israel and the Israeli security services and try to catch them and hand them over back to the Israelis? It's not an easy choice. But suppose that those prisoners don't go into Palestinian territory and they go into Jordan. That also is an embarrassment, a difficult, tight spot for the Jordanian government and authorities. Do they catch them and hand them back to the Israelis? Do they protect them? Do they allow them to sort of go away somewhere else? And finally, last but not necessarily least, what if they tried to escape into southern Lebanon? What would happen then? Southern Lebanon is pretty much controlled for all intents and purposes by the Hezbollah militias in the country. They are known to be supportive of the Palestinian quest for liberation. Are they going to support them? Are they going to protect them? Are they going to try and make sure that they remain safe? And if they do that, will they not be risking an Israeli riposte, an Israeli response? Would that create another mini war? So it's a difficult moment for many, many parties, but it's a very daring escape. And this is going to lead to much soul searching within the Israeli intelligence and security services. And it happened, guess when? On New Year's Day for the Jewish people, Rosh Hashanah. And in that sense, it's a day of tourism, of relaxation, and a lot of people who might have gone toward those areas. This is now no man's land until we know what happens to the fate of those Palestinian prisoners who escaped the Gilboa prison. Remaining in Israel and slightly changing my ethnicity toward the Armenian ethnicity, which is my favorite theme when I talk about ethnicities, I just wanted to sort of draw your attention and the attention of many of my Armenian viewers and followers that I learned recently that a 99-year real estate deal had been signed by the Armenian Patriarchate in Jerusalem, which is located in one of the four quarters of the old city of Jerusalem. That is a real estate deal had been signed between the Patriarchate and an Australian millionaire who will, it seems, build a hotel in a large tract of land just to the southwest of the Armenian quarter that is known in Armenian as Goverun Bardez. Goverun Bardez translates as in the cow's garden, a cow, an animal. And why is it called Goverun Bardez? Because before habitation and before houses were built, cows used to go there to graze, and that name stuck with it. Now, if it is true that this tract of land has been signed a lease of 99 years, well, I'll tell you as a lawyer that a 99-year lease, for all intents and purposes, means that it is for perpetuity. So it's sad. It's sad if it's true, and I haven't yet had time to investigate a bit more, probe a bit more as to why this happened, how could it have happened, and why is it that from the 13 traditional churches that define the Christian local faith, indigenous faith of Palestinians in Jerusalem and across Palestine, why is it that we constantly keep getting stories of Armenian Orthodox Patriarchate and Greek Orthodox Patriarchates selling land to Israel? Is it because they need the land? It's too easy to sort of say, oh, they're traitors, oh, they're Greeks and Armenians, they don't have any Palestinian feeling. I disagree with that. There are many, the majority of them, both patriarchates, both churches are very much pro-Palestinian. They are Palestinian themselves, either culturally or ethnically. So it's a good question as, is it the money? Is it something else? Anyway, I wanted to throw this in now. I'm not going to deal with this here. I will probably deal with it later when I have some better understanding of what's happening in the Armenian theme of my YouTubes. Then I jump to Daraa. Now, it's very interesting because we have been hearing how the Syrian regime has been bombarding Daraa, trying to get rid of all the people who are against the regime. In other words, trying to reacquire Daraa as it tries to spread its authority across much of the country following the Arab uprisings. Now, this is interesting because Russia is playing a role, as Russia plays a role in anything Syrian these days. Russia is playing a role to try and quieten down spirits and to try and reach an agreement whereby some kind of a ceasefire would be arranged and an understanding as to how to deal with this latest standoff between the Syrian regime and the fighters in Daraa who are against the regime. But this comes within the context of a larger, in my opinion, a larger story. And that story is that there are clear signs, and there have been clear signs for much now. Read the wonderful academic Ziad Majid, read others, and you can find out that there is a constant and increasing quest for the re-legitimization of Syria in the region. And from there, I suppose, the hope of those people trying to re-legitimize the regime in the region would hope that the West would also gradually forget the history of the last 10 years and suddenly start working with Bashar al-Assad and his people. Now, why am I putting those two together? I'm putting those two together because if you followed the news, and if you didn't, I'm telling you that a high-level delegation went from Lebanon to Syria, from Beirut to Damascus only a couple of days ago in order to negotiate a way whereby gas supplies and electricity supplies would reach Lebanon transiting through Syria. And they went there, and it was the first official high-level delegation there. They went there in order to meet with their Syrian counterparts and see whether Syria would allow this transit of gas and electricity to happen. And of course, Syria being the Syria of Arabism, Surya al-Uruba, of course they are going to do that. But what interested me there are two things. One, in the press conference that happened afterwards, there was a Syrian flag, but there was no Lebanese flag, which made me scratch my head and wonder why. Does Syria no longer consider Lebanon an independent sovereign country? Anyway, the more worrying thing in terms of re-legitimization, forgetting the political gimmicks of flags and what have you, is that there will be follow-up meetings to this meeting in Damascus, in Jordan probably, and perhaps even later in Cairo. And this is all part and parcel of getting us in the West and the ordinary men and women in the MENA region, getting them, and the Gulf, of course, because the Gulf is nowadays uncertain which way it turns when it comes to Syria. Are they with or against the regime? It depends on the country. To get people to get used to the idea that Syria and Bashar al-Assad and his retinue are coming back in from the cold. Will that happen? I don't know, time will tell. We are living in such bizarre times that anything is possible tomorrow that would completely counteract and countervail what happened today. From Syria and Lebanon and the region, let me also very quickly say that there was a story that might interest you of one of the 7 sons of Muammar al-Qadhafi, the ruler of Libya who was killed again during the revolutionary uprisings. His name is Saadi Qadhafi. Qadhafi had 7 sons. 3 of them died. 4 of them, one of them Saiful Islam Qadhafi. Saiful Islam in Arabic means the sword of Islam. Qadhafi, he wants to become president. He will probably try to run in the presidential elections, the forthcoming ones. But this one was known to be a famous footballer, a professional footballer, and he was also known in Libyan circles and people who are very good on Libya and who constantly supply us with news such as Mary Fitzgerald and others. They would have probably heard that he was known to be an amateur playboy as well. But he was in jail for a number of years, and then the court decided that he was innocent. He was freed from captivity and took the plane and went straight to Istanbul in Turkey. Interesting, the Qadhafi family, we haven't heard the last of them. And now finally, I want to leave you with a few thoughts. It is really food for thought. I'm not going to analyze it with you. I'm not going to give you my opinion as such per se. I'm going to just give you a few hints and let you make your mind up about what? About Afghanistan. Now you will tell me, Harry, Afghanistan is not in your MENA and Gulf region, and I will tell you you're right. You will tell me, Harry, Afghanistan, you are not an expert, between inverted commas, because every falafel seller these days is an expert, and no injurious attribution to falafel sellers. I love falafel sandwiches. So you're not an expert on Afghanistan. You're not well read on Afghanistan. Let me put it more politely. How come you're talking of Afghanistan? Well, everybody seems to be doing it. And the more I hear, the more I listen to bizarre claims and think, really? Is this the level of analysis that we get on our television screens and on our radio and social media platforms? So my foods for thought, just 4 points. You do whatever you want with them. If Afghanistan doesn't interest you, the trash bin is next to you on your computer screen. 1, we keep talking about a new Taliban. The new Taliban that is different from the Taliban of the late 1990s and early noughties, that it is different and therefore it will respect this and that and will allow demonstrations and public protests. It will allow women to do this. It will allow men to do that. I'm going to spin that on its head and ask you the question. Yes, maybe the Taliban is a new Taliban because after 20 years, it could well be that a new generation has crept in with the older generation. But also remember that Afghanistan itself is a new Afghanistan. So it's not only the Taliban that are new, Afghanistan is a new country as well. And that matters in the political configurations that we will see in the next weeks and months and perhaps even years. And that sort of takes me to the government formation. People are saying, where is this government? Why isn't it happening? And I'm thinking to myself, give me a break. There are so many tribes and so many minorities and so many people who have a stake, who are stakeholders in Afghanistan, that of course it is taking time for a government to be formed. And that government will probably be a temporary government until such time as the dust settles, and then we might actually see the more professional, political, veteran people being nominated as ministers. And the third thing I would like to leave as food for thought is the business of women's rights. Now, since day one, most of what I've been hearing from news and from interviewers and from anchors and guests, oh, women, what will happen to women? Let me tell you something. In my estimation, there are at least 2 different categories or brackets of women. The women you keep hearing of, about, oh, they work, they read the news, they go to the coffee shops and sit outside and drink coffees, they do this, they do that, they practice their professions, they're all over social media in Afghanistan. These are the rural women, sorry, the urban women, apology, the urban women of Kabul, the capital. If you go into the hinterlands of Afghanistan, and Afghanistan is a huge country, you will notice that the women there are not like the women in Kabul, the capital, and in the much more westernized, after 20 years of American and UK, plus let's say Western occupation, they are different. And so when we talk about those women doing this and that, and they're very upset because they no longer will be able to do this and that, let us remember that we're talking about the urban women of the capital, Kabul, and some well-known women who were allowed to flourish and westernize their approach to their own lives by their own choice, whereas a lot more of the women in the countryside, in the rural areas, were not. And I'll tell you what, whilst Kabul was being fated during those 20 odd years, there were constantly fights in the rural areas. There were fights between different militias, between different fundamentalist ideologies, between the government and other movements. And at the same time, there still was the repression of women in these places where the Western camera did not reach. And therefore, a lot of women, I suspect, might well be saying today, and I'm saying something dangerous in the sense that many women are going to say, Harry, you're an old-fashioned pig. What are you talking about? Well, I'm not old-fashioned if you know anything about me, and I have news for you, I'm not a pig either. But those people there might now say, during those 20 years, we had constant fighting and uncertainty, instability, and we had the repression. Now we have the repression, but we no longer have the fighting and the constant uncertainty or instability. Maybe for them, not for those in Kabul, maybe that is progress. I don't know, I said food for thought. You might think about this, mull over it and say that reasoning is rubbish, it's not Socratic, let's throw it to one side. And finally, I would also bring it to the key issue of the lesson we need to draw from Afghanistan and from many other places across the world. Cultures are different. Nobody says that my culture, as an Armenian, as a European, as a universalist, whatever you want to call me, is the best culture. Different people come from different cultures. Those cultures are impacted by upbringing, family, culture, religion, school, education, profession, work, interpersonal relations. So culture is the underbelly of most countries, and it opens up a whole pivot of factors. Who says we should go and introduce our culture there, and if they don't do things the way we do it, then they're not civilized? I leave that with a big question mark for you to deal with. Sociologists would have a field day trying to unravel and then put back together that whole idea of politics, culture, relativism, and what have you. So I leave you there. Once again, it was nice talking to you, even if it's only virtually. And once again, I say, Georges Nassif, rest in peace.